Our sermon title this morning is called Debasing Grace, How Shriek the Sound. And what I hope to show through the passage is that's how all of the people that are responding to grace are reacting to it. They hear the grace of Jesus and they shriek at the sound of it because it takes them off of the throne of their lives. Now, if you're new to the Gospels at all, what we see in the Gospels is a pattern of teaching miracles. And it's a mistake to approach the Gospels and think that these are kind of unrelated, unconnected events. They're all connected together. If we look at a miracle and say, well, that's really neat, we totally are going to miss what Jesus is teaching us through it. Remember, Jesus said in John chapter 2, actually it was the author John, after Jesus turned the water into wine, the author John said this was the first of his signs. And then the rest of the book, every miracle that Jesus performs is a sign. What does a sign do? It teaches us something. It's not just merely for us to say, wow, that's cool. All the signs in the book of John show us, number one, who Jesus is. Namely, that He is the Son of God, God Himself, and that He was sent into the world to rescue sinners. And secondly, all the signs in John are signs to show us who we are. Law-breaking, undone, ruined sinners without any hope in the world except for Christ. And the miracle in John chapter 9 is no different. Jesus miraculously gave this blind man his sight as a sign of two things. Number one, that Jesus is the light of the world. And number two, that we are hopelessly blind and lost without Him. Now, we looked at this miracle 2 weeks ago. And now we turn to the people's response to the miracle. And what I want to show this morning, God willing, is that the people's response to the miracle is also a sign. How do the people in this passage respond to this miracle? With unbelief, with ingratitude, and with hatred. Why? Why? Why would you respond to a miracle like that? Because this miracle displays the grace of the gospel. And human beings hate grace. We naturally despise grace. Why? Why would we naturally despise grace? That seems so unnatural. Because grace sabotages our self-righteousness. It sabotages it. Debasing grace. How shriek the sound that blames a wretch like me. Blames me. Finds me guilty. Unable to stand before God on my own. I have to rely on someone outside of me. Grace is a plague to self-righteous hearts like mine and yours. Grace assassinates our ability to boast in anything that comes from ourselves. And we, as a human race, above almost everything else, love the sound of this. Consider a moment that we're going to sing Amazing Grace in the second set. And I want you to especially pay attention to that second line in it. John Newton said, "'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear." You ever thought about that line? 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear. What the heck did John Newton mean? Grace taught my heart to fear? Shouldn't grace teach my heart to love? Why fear? Well, what is grace? Grace is the unmerited, unearned love and favor of God. That's what grace is. Grace isn't a help to our self-righteous acts that we're already doing. Grace is a help to ruined and undone and undeserving God-hating sinners. There's nothing that you and I can do to coerce or to convince God to give us grace. Otherwise, it wouldn't be grace. He's free to give it or not. This is what Paul said in Romans 9, quoting God. I will have mercy on whom I have mercy. I will have compassion on whom I have compassion, so that it depends not on human will or exertion, but on God who has mercy. That's what grace is. And if you and I begin to understand that, it will cause our heart to fear. Because there's nothing that we can do to make God give it to us. The human race hates this because it takes us off the throne of our lives. And that's what's happening in this passage. This blind man is put on display to the watching world that Jesus Christ gives grace at his good pleasure, and it doesn't depend on human effort. And the world cannot stand this sight. All right, so we're going to see this in three ways from our passage. If you're taking notes, the first section is the unbelief of grace. The unbelief of grace. This is the conversation between the man and his neighbors. Secondly, the ingratitude towards grace. This is the conversation between the parents and the Pharisees. And then thirdly, the hatred of grace. This is the conversation between the Pharisees and the man. The unbelief of grace, the ingratitude towards grace, and the hatred of grace. Here's our big idea. Keep coming back to this if you get lost. All mankind blindly hates grace. But Jesus came to open our eyes so that we might treasure it. All mankind blindly hates grace, but Jesus Christ came to open our eyes so that we might treasure it. So let's first turn to the unbelief of grace. We saw from 2 weeks ago in verses 1 through 6 that Jesus and his disciples passed by this man who was blind from birth. And what did Jesus do? He spits in the dirt, makes some mud, wipes it on his face, and says, "Go wash." The man goes and washes, and then he came back seeing. And then picking up in verse 7, we see the first conversation in this passage between the man born blind and his neighbors. Picking up in verse 7. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" Some said, "It is he." Others said, "No, but he is like him." He kept saying, "I am the man." And then the man goes on to tell them how his eyes were opened. Now, for the most part, this crowd remains in unbelief. Some were persuaded, of course, but this passage from verses 8 through 38 is taking us from one conversation to another. Neighbors, Pharisees, parents, man. And the link that connects all of those conversations together is unbelief. It's an unwillingness to admit what happened to this man. And so my question in this first conversation is this: why wouldn't this crowd believe that this miracle took place? Why? It's not difficult for us to understand that 21st century modern atheists would, of course, disbelieve in this miracle. But this is a Jewish crowd. They were connected to Moses. They had a heritage where they had a whole Bible full of miracles. So why did they not believe? Here's what I think. I think this crowd stumbled over the same thing that Jesus' disciples did. Remember, the disciples asked Jesus in verse 2, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Remember, the disciples believed that there was some secret sin on the part of the man, and that this secret sin explained the suffering, because they reasoned that righteous people don't suffer. This is what we've been teaching for a couple years now, Christian karma. Your actions, if you do good things will happen to you. If you do bad things will happen to you. That's the theology that they believed. But this was 100% anti-Christ. And I think that this crowd reasoned similarly. Good things, like miracles, only happen to good people. They don't happen to blind, begging sinners. But what does Jesus say in verse 3? Remember this from last time. It was not that this man sinned, or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We so need to get this, brothers and sisters, because this type of theology needs to govern our lives. Jesus is saying that it is not sin, in this case, that is the ultimate reason for this man's blindness. Yes, he is a sinner. But the decisive cause for this man's blindness is one thing, namely, so that the world would see the grace of Jesus Christ. The world is a stage. And the main character on that stage is Christ and his grace for his people. And he does everything in time and space in order to display that. But that's not how these neighbors viewed God. And so they struggled to believe this miracle. And so we move on to the next conversation. These neighbors bring this man to the Pharisees in verse 13. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. So the Pharisees again asked him how he received his sight. And he said to them, "You put mud on my eyes, I washed, and I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a man who is a sinner do such things?" And there was a division among them. Now, why would Jesus perform this miracle on the Sabbath when he knew that